The morning heat clung heavy over Saipan. June 1944. The coral dust rose with every shuffle of boots, and behind a thin line of Marines walked groups of defeated Japanese soldiers. Their uniforms were ripped, salt-stained, and dark with days of sweat. Some clutched canteens, long emptied. Others dragged their feet. Each step was a humiliation. They had been trained to fight to the death. Here they were, alive, in enemy hands. The silence was broken only by the crunch of boots and the buzz of flies circling bodies left behind in the minds of the captives. Surrender meant starvation or worse. Stories had circulated. Americans execute prisoners. Americans mock the weak. Some believed they might be paraded for ridicule. Others whispered that their families would never learn their fate. When a Marine barked a command in clipped English, most froze, expecting a strike. Instead, they were pushed forward, not beaten. It confused them more than brutality ever could. Saipan had consumed nearly everything. Estimates suggest nearly 29,000 Japanese were killed or captured in the battle. Soldiers who survived often had no weapons left, no food, and no hope. A diary later recovered noted simply, "We are already dead." For the prisoners walking under that Pacific sun, life now depended on the mercy of their enemy. One soldier, bones visible through his skin, muttered in disbelief, "We thought surrender meant starvation." His comrades stayed silent, staring at the horizon, where smoke still curled from the wreck of a Type 95 tank. The war had shrunk to survival by afternoon. The column passed through makeshift gates of barbed wire strung between wooden posts. Inside were rows of tar paper barracks. The guards stood tall, rifles across their chests, scanning the line with unreadable expressions. The captives braced themselves for abuse. They had not eaten properly in days. Ached with thirst, they prepared for punishment, for shame, for hunger. Instead, what drifted toward them was something else entirely. The air smelled strange warm, earthy, like bread or cooking grains. Some prisoners blinked, thinking it was a trick of memory. Their stomachs twisted at the scent. Hunger gnawed with every inhale. One soldier whispered that Americans might be feasting just to torment them. But the truth was far more bewildering, because what awaited them inside the camp was not cruelty, but food, and with that smell came the beginning of their greatest shock. The barbed wire gates closed with a metallic clang. Inside stretched rows of wooden barracks, their tar paper roofs shining under the Saipan sun. Dust swirled in the gaps between structures where sentries paced in practiced rhythm. For the Japanese prisoners, every plank and post screamed captivity, yet one detail unsettled them most: the smell. It was not rot, not waste, not the stench of corpses that haunted their memories of jungle caves. Instead, it was food, thick, warm, unmistakable. Men looked at each other, some frowning, others shaking their heads in disbelief. "Trick," one muttered under his breath. Another hissed back, "They want us weak with false hope." Yet, as the column moved deeper, the scent grew stronger: bread, baking, perhaps rice, even meat. Hunger sharpened every step. For soldiers who had fought weeks on half bowls of gruel, this aroma was more disorienting than a rifle butt to the skull. Guard towers loomed above them, but the Americans did not jeer. They barked orders, yes, but not with cruelty. Prisoners were divided into groups, pointed toward barracks that already stood stocked with cots. It was not luxury, but it was shelter solid, dry, with space to lie flat, something unthinkable in the caves of Saipan. One man brushed his hand across the rough wooden wall and muttered, "Even this feels more secure than the Emperor gave us." By 1945, records indicate the United States held over 50,000 Japanese prisoners in camps across the Pacific Theater. They were distributed between islands like Guam, Hawaii, and further inland. Each facility was managed under strict Geneva Convention guidelines, though the prisoners themselves rarely believed such rules existed. Their own army had treated them as expendable. Now they were faced with an inversion of reality, their enemy enforcing humane order. A Marine passed carrying a pot. Steam rose in a white column, and the scent nearly buckled knees. One Japanese soldier whispered, "Even the air smelled of bread, not death." For the first time since surrender, heads turned, not in shame, but in disbelief. What if food was real? What if this camp was not punishment, but survival? The questions hung heavier than the heat. But the true shock would not come from guards or government rations. It would walk in wearing straw hats and carrying crates from local fields. The next morning began with a sound unfamiliar to captured soldiers, wagon wheels crunching over coral gravel. The prisoners, clustered inside the barbed wire compound, turned their heads. What they saw unsettled them more than rifles ever could. Approaching the gates were not Marines in helmets, but civilians in straw hats, shirts rolled up, dust coating their boots. Farmers, their hands were calloused, their faces sunburned. They walked without fear, carrying crates stacked high. The guards opened the gate briefly, just enough for the wagons to roll in. The smell of wood and straw filled the air as boxes were lowered, thumping onto the dirt. The prisoners leaned forward, straining for a glimpse. When the first crate was opened, the camp seemed to pause. Eggs, dozens upon dozens of eggs, neatly packed, clean, fragile yet plentiful. For men accustomed to rationing moldy rice, the sight of such abundance was surreal. Whispers ran through the ranks. "Is this for us?" One muttered, "Impossible." Another scoffed, "Perhaps they feed chickens better than captives." Yet the guards handed baskets to Japanese prisoners, motioning them to carry them into the barracks kitchen. The POS obeyed slowly, almost reverently, as though holding treasure. Statistics bear the scale of what they were seeing. By 1945, American farms produced over 68 billion eggs annually, an output vast enough to feed not only their own troops, but also enemy prisoners without strain. For captives who came from an empire struggling to import basic rice and fish, the numbers were incomprehensible. The eggs were not symbolic, they were logistical proof of a nation drowning in abundance. One soldier whispered hoarsely, "Why would enemy farmers feed us?" He shook his head, clutching the edge of the crate as though it might vanish. The thought that enemy civilians, non-combatants, would supply food to men they had fought just days before shattered expectations. And as the eggs were carried in, more wagons arrived. The squeak of wooden wheels, the splash of sloshing buckets. This time, the prisoners' eyes widened even further. The crates of eggs were only the beginning. The farmers had brought something that many of the men had not tasted since childhood in rural Japan: fresh milk. The prisoners were still murmuring about the eggs when the sound of liquid sloshing stole their attention. Farmers in straw hats lifted tin buckets from their wagons, each brimming with white froth that glistened under the Pacific sun. A faint, sweet smell drifted through the compound. The guards waved the prisoners closer, motioning them to line up. For a moment, no one moved. Milk, here. Impossible. One Marine pried the lid off a bucket, and steam hissed faintly from the warmth of fresh milking. The liquid was poured into dented metal tins, filling them until froth spilled over the edges. Poe stared, jaws tight, breaths shallow. Two men who had spent years drinking only water, tea, or watery gruel. The sight was dreamlike. It triggered memories buried under war childhood breakfasts in villages, school lunches long forgotten. A few prisoners whispered in disbelief. "It can't be real," one muttered, his eyes refusing to blink. Another clenched his fists. "This is deception." Yet the smell betrayed no trick. It was fresh milk, rich, creamy, and undeniable. The scale was staggering. Wisconsin alone supplied nearly 20% of U.S. milk production during the 1940s, enough to keep soldiers, civilians, and even captured enemies nourished. Back in Japan, food shortages meant milk was rare even for children. By the late war years, many had not tasted it at all. The contrast was brutal. The empire they had fought for could not feed them, while the enemy poured abundance into battered tin cups. When the first cups were handed out, hands shook violently. A young prisoner lifted his cup to his lips, hesitated, then drank. Milk streaked down his chin. His eyes widened, then watered not from pain, but from something harder to control. Tears rolled as he gulped. Others followed, some drinking cautiously, others clutching their cups as if afraid the guards might snatch them back. One soldier whispered, "We hadn't seen milk since childhood." The words were not defiance, but surrender to a truth larger than armies. The enemy could provide what their own homeland could not. That realization tore deeper than bullets, and in that moment, the unthinkable happened. Hardened men, trained to fight to the death, broke down in front of strangers, weeping over something as simple as milk. The camp grew quiet as the first prisoners lowered their cups, lips coated with milk. At first it was silence, then came the sound of choking. Not from poison, not from fear, these were sobs, raw and guttural, breaking through the rigid discipline of soldiers who had been told all their lives that tears were shame. Men hunched over, shoulders heaving, tin cups trembling in their hands. For the guards, it was startling. For the prisoners, it was unbearable. One man, a former sergeant, tried to stand tall as he drank. His hand shook so badly that the milk splashed onto his tunic. He swallowed fast, but his throat caught, and suddenly he was weeping uncontrollably. Others turned away, ashamed to watch, yet the tears spread like contagion. These were men who had crawled out of caves under artillery fire, who had watched comrades blow themselves up with grenades rather than surrender. Now they cried because of milk. Their breakdown made sense only in contrast. In Imperial Army camps, diaries speak of rations so thin they barely kept men alive. Rice gruel, sometimes mixed with weeds, sometimes nothing at all. Malnutrition crippled entire units before battles even began. Here, in enemy hands, the sudden taste of nutrition was not just physical relief, was humiliation. A collapse of everything drilled into them. One prisoner whispered in a voice, thick with tears, "It was like drinking our shame." The cup in his hands was both salvation and accusation. Every sip screamed that the empire had failed to care for its own, while the enemy, the hated other, offered plenty. That contradiction tore deeper than bayonets. The guards did not laugh, did not mock. They let the men cry. Some Marines turned their eyes away, others kept their gaze steady, but none interrupted. The prisoners' weeping echoed through the compound, mixing with the clatter of buckets being refilled by dusk. The ground was dotted with small spills of milk, white stains drying in the dust. The POWs stared at them like symbols of weakness exposed. Yet even as shame gnawed at them, hunger overcame pride. They would drink again tomorrow, and in that fragile moment, comparison began the old meals of moldy rice against these strange gifts of eggs and milk. Morning came with clatter-metal trays, footsteps on gravel, guards motioning the prisoners forward. The Japanese lined up, still stiff from shame, still cautious of tricks. A kitchen detail emerged with baskets, and when the contents were revealed, the disbelief deepened. Whole eggs, boiled, peeled, steaming. The smell alone was enough to hollow stomachs further. Soldiers who had been nourished on a handful of rice for days now held protein-rich food in their hands. Each bite triggered memory. One prisoner recalled shivering in a cave on Saipan, sharing a moldy lump of rice with 4 men. Another remembered scraping at weeds by a roadside, boiling them to color the broth. Their army had rationed barely 1,800 calories per man per day, sometimes less. Many marched to battle already weakened, their bodies spent before combat even began. Here, the contrast was brutal. American soldiers routinely consumed nearly 4,000 calories daily meat. Bread, fruit, coffee, chocolate. Even prisoners, even enemies, were being handed food surpassing what imperial soldiers on campaign had received. It was not kindness alone. It was logistics. Abundance was a weapon in itself. One man chewed slowly, eyes wet, then muttered, "The enemy fed us better than our emperor." The words cut through the line, unspoken but felt by all. The act of eating became an act of betrayal in their own minds, as though each bite admitted weakness, admitted failure of the homeland they had pledged to die for. Yet hunger had no ideology. One after another, they finished every crumb. The guards stood by, impassive, enforcing order but not cruelty. The eggs, the bread, the occasional meat stewed they kept arriving, regular, predictable, enough to keep men alive. This rhythm of nourishment disoriented prisoners more than beatings ever could. It told them they were no longer in the world they knew. Still, food was only the first layer. The shock did not end at calories. When trucks arrived stacked with surplus supplies, when the scale of America's industrial output revealed itself in casual deliveries, the prisoners began to understand something larger than their hunger. They were staring into the machinery of abundance, and it dwarfed everything they had ever known. By late afternoon, the hum of engines rolled through the compound. Liberty trucks, their canvas flaps tied back, growled into view. The prisoners turned to watch as dust swirled behind the tires. Guards barked orders, and the vehicles backed up against the supply sheds. Tailgates clanged open. Then came the avalanche. Boxes of canned meat, sacks of flour, crates of vegetables, and cartons of cigarettes tumbled out, stacked high in neat rows. The guards moved with routine indifference, as though unloading a market stall. For the prisoners, it was paralyzing. They watched mountains of food pile up so much that a portion rotted in the sun before it could even be used. One soldier whispered hoarsely, "They waste what we would die for." Another clenched his fists, unable to reconcile what he saw. The Japanese military had told them Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of sacrifice. Yet here was proof of the opposite. A nation so productive it could fight wars across oceans while still burying its enemies in surplus. Statistics sharpened the scale. In 1945, US farms produced enough wheat alone to feed an estimated 330 million people, more than twice the combined populations of Japan and Germany at the time. This was not just supply. It was industrial dominance, a weapon invisible but decisive. One POW, staring at the growing stack of sacks, muttered, "America fought with stomachs full." His words carried the bitterness of truth. Their own homeland, blockaded and bombed, starved its soldiers and civilians alike. Mothers in Japan diluted rice with sweet potatoes. Soldiers chewed bark in desperation. And yet here, inside barbed wire, the enemy delivered feasts without effort. The guards didn't gloat. They handled boxes casually, some smoking as they worked, as though abundance were a given. That nonchalance struck harder than arrogance. To the prisoners, it meant this was not an extraordinary gesture. This was everyday America. The realization cut deep. Food wasn't just survival, here it was cultural shock. And the most jarring proof of that abundance would not come from trucks or warehouses, but from something smaller, stranger, laughter floating on the wind. The camp quiet was broken not by orders or engines, but by laughter. High-pitched, careless, rolling across the barbed wire like music foreign to men used to war. The Japanese prisoners turned their heads. Beyond the perimeter, in a patch of open ground, local farm children were playing. Baseball gloves slapped leather, a ball cracked against wood, and the kids shouted to one another without fear. For the POWs, it was disorienting. They had marched past villages in flames, seen children huddled silent in caves, trained to expect civilians to scatter at their approach. Here, the civilians' children, no leisure, freely within sight of captured soldiers. Some pointed, some giggled. A few even mimicked exaggerated salutes, mocking gestures without malice. The humiliation cut sharper than barbed wire. Hardened soldiers, once sworn to fight until death, now stood barefoot in dust while children laughed nearby, unafraid. One prisoner clenched his jaw, whispering through his teeth, "Even their children mocked us with happiness." It was not cruelty, but indifference, proof that the enemy's youngest no longer feared them. Numbers underlined the reality. In 1945, America counted over 20 million school-aged children. Their daily lives continued even as fathers fought overseas. Playgrounds, classrooms, and baseball fields thrived in a way unimaginable in bombed-out Tokyo or starved Okinawa. For POWs watching that game, the statistics became flesh, an entire society untouched by famine. Secure enough the kids could laugh within earshot of prisoners, who once vowed to conquer them. One soldier pressed his face to the wire, eyes fixed on the ball flying high into the sky. It was not the game that hurt, but the sound, the casual joy, the proof that the war had failed to reach these children. He thought of his own son, hungry back home, never having seen a baseball glove. The laughter burned worse than hunger. The guards didn't interfere. They let the game continue, the noise weaving through the compound. It was another kind of abundance, not just food, but spirit. And as twilight deepened, a new layer of shock washed over the camp, carried not by children's voices, but by a strange rhythm pulsing from a nearby barrack radio, leaking American music into the night. Night fell over the compound, but instead of silence, sound drifted across the barracks. Not boots, not commands music. A soft hiss of static gave way to brass, drums, and clarinets weaving together in swinging rhythm. The Japanese prisoners froze. Some tilted their heads, searching for the source. It came from a small radio propped on a crate where two Marines leaned, smoking casually, tapping their boots to the beat. The melody was Benny Goodman, a name unknown to most of the captives but unmistakably American. It was loud enough to bleed across the camp, notes climbing over the barbed wire as if mocking captivity itself. For men raised on martial songs and shouted slogans, the rhythm was disarming. They had been told Americans were weak, decadent. Yet this music pulsed with energy, confidence, and life. Some prisoners covered their ears, muttering curses. Others sat still, secretly listening, unable to turn away. A few whispered of home, how long since they had heard any music not about sacrifice or death. The Imperial Army drilled men with chants, not melodies. Here, the enemy filled nights with art. The statistics behind that sound spoke volumes. By 1945, nearly 96% of American households owned radios. Music was not rare. It was daily life, broadcast into kitchens, fields, even battlefront camps. The same technology that carried coded messages also carried swing, reminding soldiers and civilians alike that life was more than survival. For the POWs, hearing it inside a prison was salt in the wound. One muttered bitterly, "Even prisoners could not escape their music." He spat into the dust but kept listening, his body swaying almost imperceptibly. Another stared at the glowing dial of the radio as though it was sorcery. The more they heard, the clearer it became. America fought with more than weapons, it fought with culture. The guards laughed at a joke, cigarette embers glowing red in the dark, and turned up the volume. The saxophone solo soared, echoing through the barracks. The prisoners shifted uneasily on their cots, wondering what shock tomorrow would bring. Their answer came not through sound, but through cardboard boxes stamped with a red symbol of neutrality, parcels that carried comfort, soap, and chocolate straight into their hands. The next morning, the camp gates creaked open once again, but instead of wagons or trucks, guards rolled in handcarts stacked with plain brown boxes. Each was stamped with a bold red cross. The prisoners recognized the symbol neutrality, medicine, distant rumors of aid. They gathered close, suspicious but hungry for anything new. The guards set the boxes down and cut them open. Out spilled contents that seemed almost impossible. Chocolate bars, wrapped neatly. Packs of cigarettes, American brands. Tins of meat. Small cakes of soap. The smell of tobacco mixed with cocoa in the humid air. Some POWs stepped back as though the parcels might be poisoned. Others surged forward, eyes fixed on the strange luxuries. A corporal motioned with his rifle, ordering them to line up. One by one, men were handed items. A chocolate square melted instantly in a prisoner's mouth, its sweetness overwhelming after years of deprivation. Another struck a match and lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply, his hands trembling. The soap provoked the strongest reaction. Many had not touched real soap in months. One man rubbed it against his palms, inhaling the faint scent, whispering disbelief. Reports indicate that by late 1944, as many as 24,000 Red Cross parcels were shipped monthly across Ali-Drun camps. They included food, toiletries, and letters. To the Japanese POWs, each box was not merely a gift, was a crushing comparison. Their own comrades in imperial camps starved without aid. Some had died for scraps of food that here were handed out casually by the enemy. One soldier muttered bitterly, "Our men died for soap, while Americans handed it away." His voice cracked between rage and awe. That small bar, fragrant and clean, symbolized everything upside down in their world. The enemy treated them better than their own commanders had. The guards didn't comment. They distributed the parcels with mechanical efficiency, moving down the line. The men carried their treasures back to the barracks, some cradling chocolate, others hiding soap in their tunics as if it might be stolen. It was not cruelty that humiliated them. It was kindness so casual it stripped their pride bare. And as these small exchanges continued, the relationship between guard and captive began to change. The rifles remained, but now, sometimes, so did a nod or a wordless gesture of recognition. The parcels had been distributed, the crates emptied, but the shock lingered. Prisoners sat in small groups, clutching soap, nibbling chocolate, drawing on cigarettes as though they were relics. The guards patrolled as usual, rifles slung, but something had shifted. For the first time, eyes met across the wire without hostility. One Marine paused by the kitchen tent, holding a boiled egg. He looked at the prisoners, then at the food in his hand. Without a word, he stepped closer, extended it across the gap, and placed it into the palm of a Japanese soldier. The man froze, staring at the egg as if it burned. Slowly, he bowed his head and stepped back. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. Moments like these unsettled the prisoners more than threats. Under the Geneva Convention, the US Army had strict guidelines. Prisoners were to be housed, fed, and treated humanely. For the captives, this wasn't just policy, was a psychological weapon. They had expected cruelty, and instead they found rules, structure, even decency. It eroded the armor of hate across the compound. Similar exchanges multiplied. A guard poured an extra ladle of stew for a weak prisoner. Another looked away as two men shared a cigarette against regulations. These weren't acts of rebellion, they were small gestures of humanity, and each one cut deep. One prisoner muttered to his comrade, "Kindness became more frightening than bullets." He wasn't exaggerating. Bullets killed the body. Kindness killed certainty. It forced men to question the emperor's propaganda, to wonder if everything they had been told was false. At night, the barracks buzzed, not with plans of escape, but with whispered debates. Could Americans truly see them as human? Why offer soap, food, or eggs to enemies sworn to fight them? Some clung to anger. Others quietly admitted they no longer knew what to believe. The guards never spoke of ideology. Their gestures were practical, even casual, but the effect was profound. The POWs felt their worldview slipping, piece by piece, replaced not by lectures, but by lived experience. And soon, this internal fracture would surface more openly. Soldiers admitting aloud that America could not be defeated. Not by force, not by hunger, not by faith alone. Weeks passed, and the routines of captivity settled in. Food arrived with regularity. Farmers still came with supplies, and guards maintained discipline. But beneath the surface, something invisible shifted. The Japanese soldiers who had once clenched their fists at every kindness now spoke in whispers, no longer about escape or suicide, but about doubt. Inside the barracks, one humid night, a young lieutenant broke the silence. He had once lectured comrades about dying for the emperor, about the honor of starvation over surrender. Now, sitting cross-legged on a cot, he said softly, "We cannot defeat a nation that feeds even its enemies." No one argued. Heads bowed. For the first time, surrender felt less like shame and more like inevitability. The transformation was not sudden. It came in fragments. The taste of milk, the smell of soap, the sound of children laughing, the swing of Benny Goodman echoing from a radio. Each detail carved away at indoctrination, replacing it with lived contradictions. Men who had believed Americans were barbaric now admitted that humanity had broken through where violence could not. Surveys conducted after 1945 confirm this pattern. Many Japanese POWs, when repatriated, expressed a readiness to cooperate with the United States during occupation. They had seen firsthand what abundance and humane treatment looked like, and it reshaped their sense of the world. For some, it was the first crack in a wall of propaganda built over decades. One prisoner summarized the feeling in words. Passed quietly among the barracks, we surrendered twice, once to their weapons, once to their humanity. The phrase spread like a rumor, half shame, half relief, for soldiers who had been taught to worship, steal, and sacrifice. The idea that kindness was stronger than firepower was almost unbearable. And yet, it explained everything they had witnessed. The guards never knew how deeply these moments cut. To them, it was routine, following orders, unloading trucks, enforcing Geneva rules. To the prisoners, it was the collapse of an identity. Transformation was not just survival, it was the rewriting of what victory and defeat meant. And as days turned into months, one memory kept resurfacing above all others. A simple taste that carried more weight than bombs. That first sip of milk, that first bite of egg. It became the symbol of everything undone, a story carried back home long after the war had ended. Years after the war, long after the barbed wire had rusted and the camps had been dismantled, memories lingered in unexpected places. For many former prisoners, it was not the guns of Marines or the thunder of artillery that returned in dreams. It was something quieter, stranger, the taste of milk, the smooth shell of an egg, the smell of soap in a barracks far from home. In interviews, decades later, expos recalled their first moments of disbelief. One man, by then a grandfather, described the cup of milk he held on Saipan. It was white, warm, alive, he said, pausing as though still surprised. I had not tasted it since I was a boy. Another remembered the shame more than the sweetness. How he wept, how he felt undone not by violence but by kindness. These recollections carried weight not only as memory but as evidence of how small gestures could fracture entire. WORLDVIEWS. Postwar. Statistics underline the irony. Japan, devastated by bombing and famine, turned to imports of American dairy during Reconstruction. School children in Tokyo lined up for milk rations, shipped from the very nation that had defeated their fathers. What had been humiliation in the camps became nourishment for a new generation. The symbolism was unavoidable. One former soldier phrased it most starkly. It was milk, not bombs, that broke us. His words distilled the essence of the experience. Firepower had ended battles, but food, soap, music, and laughter had reshaped identities. What collapsed inside those barbed wire fences was not just an army, but an entire ideology. For historians, these stories reveal that victory was measured not only in weapons or territory, but in the ability to project abundance and humanity. For the men who lived it, the war's sharpest memory was not combated, was the moment their enemies' farmers walked through the gates, carrying crates of eggs. As the decades passed, those memories softened, layered with new lives, rebuilt cities, and grandchildren who never saw war. Yet for the men who once stood barefoot in Sapan's dust, the sting never faded. They had learned, against all odds, that sometimes the most decisive weapon in war is not the one that kills, but the one that feeds.